Alex here with part 13 of the Respondent. I think I may have missed a week, so I'm going to do part 14 after this. May as well do part 15 because Friday's right around the corner anyway. So I'm going to do 3 parts all in a row for you guys to catch up. And I do want to mention that part 13, interestingly enough, I agreed with almost everything for the beginning. And then the rest, I didn't disagree with it. It was just a lot of fluff. So a lot of political and abstract fluff it turned it into a really, really, really long chapter with not as much note taking on my end. But like I mentioned in the very beginning of the chapter, took notes pretty feverishly. So let's go through those. The top one is, he says it's impossible to explain parental alienation to people who haven't been through it. I don't know if I would say it's impossible, but I would say it is very close to impossible. It's just a very counterintuitive. People just don't believe it or don't understand why somebody would do it. A lot of people think, well, don't you want what's best for your kids? Don't you want your kids to have both parents? I just don't understand why they would do it. Or they think that the other parent has done something to justify it, like they are a horrible, evil, abusive, terrible parent, and so the alienation is justified. That's typically the initial sort of knee-jerk reaction people have when they try to get it. So I do agree with him that if they haven't been through it, it's very difficult for them to get their head around it. A lot of people will just like stop listening. So like if you have like a parental alienation video on YouTube, the people who are going to watch it are the people who are being subjected to it. Anyone else is going to like watch it for like 10 seconds and move on. They're not going to get it. It's going to be a strange thing for them. Next is generic statistical issues of a child who doesn't have one of their parents. Yeah, I mean, the statistics have been talked about for a long time with regards to how it impacts boys versus girls to not have one of their parents. The problem is, how does that help somebody understand specifically what's going to happen in their case? And most of the political fluff and the gender war stuff towards the middle and end of the chapter, it's the same thing. There are a lot of sort of general statements that he makes that are, for the most part, accepted by people, but they just don't help you understand what's going on in his specific case. Anybody can cite a sort of general overarching principle. The real question is, how does that apply specifically to your case? I guess he's also trying to push policy change. He is actually trying to do that. I'm going to save this towards the end of the video because I don't want to get stuck on this. So the next thing, at least not yet. So the next thing he says is Dr. Steve Miller mentions how difficult it is to spot alienation. Now, Dr. Steve Miller, I'm a huge fan of, at least from what I've seen of his. There are some videos on YouTube. I do believe he's testified in front of Congress at least once, maybe more. If it wasn't Congress, it was some legislative body of some sort. And he explains how if you find an expert on psychology or marriage and family therapy or whatever relevant sort of specialization with regards to separating families and stuff, if you find an expert, he thinks, and I agree with Dr. Miller, that they're actually more likely to get the situation exactly backwards, those are his words, than they are to fully understand what's going on. And that's because, and I don't think that the author of this book goes into it, but I do remember Dr. Steve Miller's testimony on this issue. He mentions that what they really need to understand it is training specific to parental alienation. And again, I'm talking about lowercase p, lowercase a, not like some actual syndrome that's in a book, but just the concept of one parent trying to damage the other parent's connection with their child. He thinks that you have to be extraordinarily knowledgeable in that specific niche area to really understand what's going on, and that part of that is because of similarities to Stockholm Syndrome. What he's referring to there is the child's protection and alignment with the abuser rather than the targeted parent. Yeah, I mean, that's true. I do agree with that. And I think it's because, I think I've talked about this before in a few videos, I think it's because the child feels like their life is getting torn apart and they're suffering anguish, and one of the parents, with the targeted parent, is not going to hurt them. They can just be themselves and that parent will love them. But the abuser, you have to do specific things to get this person to stop hurting you. And so they end up deciding, I'm just going to, capitulate. I'm going to do what the abuser wants me to do. I'm going to hate the other parent. they're going to calm down. They're going to stop ruining my life. I'm going to be able to be living with less anxiety than I ordinarily would. And then the other parent that's targeted, okay, well, they love me, unconditionally. So everything, I mean, that just seems to me what causes the child to gravitate towards the abuser. Later on in teenage years, I suspect it has to do with just a natural sense of narcissism and wanting to align with the more powerful parent, because it's awe-inspiring, and they have a preference. If they're going to, if they feel like they have to be either the abuser or the victim, a lot of times a teenager will think, I'd rather just be the abuser. I don't want to get stepped all over. These are my thoughts on it. Stockholm Syndrome is a little bit more, it goes into the sympathy that the hostage feels towards their captor. And in a sense, it's kind of like that, but I don't feel like it's specific enough, and that's why I talk about it in other videos. Pathological enmeshment with the child, which erodes the child's critical thinking skills. Yeah, I think that the reason why is because the child, when they exert their critical thinking skills, they will make decisions that will anger the abuser, and the abuser will inflict pain. Whether it's physical or emotional, they will hurt the child. And so I think the child's brain begins to associate being themselves, having their own opinions and ideas and critical thinking skills with pain. Like, if you think for yourself, you will suffer. And so because I believe that alienation is a systematic sort of, it's not like a thing that a parent just decides randomly, I'm just going to do this thing today. It's like they're like a machine, and they systematically subject the child to emotional torture to get them to align with them. I think that is really what leads to the enmeshment and the erosion. I think it's a survival mechanism, and the child just wants to survive. They're just tired of hurting, and they either want to eliminate the pain or mitigate the pain. They don't want it to get worse or stay the same. And so I feel like that's what's going on, is that they have to just stop thinking for themselves, and to survive, they have to think, what does the other person want me to think? What does the other person want me to do? What does the other person want me to say? Because if I don't guess correctly what the abuser wants me to do or say or think, then I'm going to be punished for it. And so I think it's just a survival mechanism it's almost like training, like a training program. I think I've called it that before. They put the targeted parent through the training program, and they also put the children through the training program. And it's really systematic. I love that word because there's no other word to describe it more accurately. It's a sort of methodical, every single hour, every single day, unending, systematic dismantling of the child's self. It's terrible. It's horrible. Next we have infantilization. Okay, that's one of the ways they do it. Yes, and my ex did that too. I remember when he was way too big to fit in a car seat. She wanted to put him into a car seat anyway because she felt like she had a right to. She didn't get to do that enough, I guess she thought, and she was basically trying to settle this score with the world, the court, the judge, whatever, in the sense that she didn't get as much custodial timeshare as she hoped for, so she was going to make him sit in the car seat. When it was way inappropriate. The other is adultification, which is treating a child like a grown-up. That one was more often than not what she did. And I think he even mentions almost like treating the child like they're in a relationship with the parent, which is disturbing and, in my opinion, what would have happened if this would have continued. And I think it's because they need to form an alliance. And the child and a parent, it's a subordinate sort of relationship. But if the parent parentifies or adultifies the child, now it's an alliance of two grown-ups, against the world or against their ex. And also it sort of flips the expectations and needs. So a lot of times the abusive parent / parental alienator, they have these needs, emotional needs, that they are not able to satisfy on their own or with people of their own age and level of maturity. And so they need the child to do that for them. And so they make it so that rather than the child relying on the parent for nurturing and emotional support and guidance, they've turned it on its head. And they end up burdening the child with this responsibility to sort of manage and comfort the parent. It's terrible, guys. It's terrible. I agree with him on that too. I mean, like I said, guys, I agree with pretty much everything he's saying. It's just that 90% of the chapter is fluff, which is fine if you've never heard that stuff before, but I've heard it before, and so I was just sort of preaching to the choir on all the other stuff. Fundamental attribution error. Yes, this is something that I think Dr. Steve Miller talks about, but it may not have been him. There may have been another expert that I heard that phrase from. I think it's a mistake as to why, and he uses the example of anger. So you have an angry man, And you say, well, that guy's angry because he has anger issues and he needs anger management therapy or whatever it's called. Well, what if you found out that the guy got punched in the face prior to walking into the office? He may be angry, but it's not because he's an angry person. He just got punched in the face, or somebody hit his car, or somebody threw something at him. I mean, what he's trying to say is just because a father is angry doesn't necessarily mean that he's got anger management problems. It could be that he's angry because of something that somebody's done to him. And once that particular thing stops happening, then the anger goes away. So I guess this was brought up by, if I remember correctly, Dr. Miller or another expert saying that there were a lot of therapists that make this mistake. It's a fundamental mistake that they just assume that the way that a parent is acting when they're in session is sort of a blueprint as to what's wrong with them, when according to these doctors and experts, you really have this obligation to sort of pick apart why a person's acting a certain way and find out if that person just has an intrinsic problem with that particular emotion, or if that person is being abused or triggered or poked or prodded. Here's my opinion on this. You're going to have to work around the court's dysfunction. If you have an incompetent judge and the court is operating in a dysfunctional manner, you can go in there and say, hey, you guys need to be better, but they're not going to do it. They have issues. They're not operating where they should be operating. And who's going to suffer? You and your child. So you often do have to end up being more mature and wiser than the very man or woman in the robes on the bench, because they just don't understand any of these concepts. And so you aren't going to be able to educate them. I can't tell you how many people I have seen that send me emails saying, how do I educate my judge? You are not going to be able to educate them. They have their own ways of getting education. They have their own programs. You cannot send them anything or scold them or lecture them or tell them they need to learn about something. It's not going to happen. You are not going to get anywhere doing that. You may actually make your case worse. Instead, the best thing that you can do is work around their ignorance or their dysfunction. And sometimes you have to make yourself into an unrealistically better person. I think there's a lawyer who's actually referred it to a Jedi training. You have to act like a Jedi. It's not a normal thing normal people do. I've referred to it as you go full, robotic. It's very unnatural to not lash out and react when you're being insulted and attacked. But if you do those things and you have an incompetent judge or a court system that doesn't have time to figure that out, you're just going to end up losing your case. So you're just going to end up having to be a person that's not you. You're going to have to not be yourself. It's a really unfair, unfortunate, strange way to live and interact with somebody else, to just sort of let them do things you wouldn't let anyone else do. But if you don't do that, you're going to go into court and lose. So you're going to make it a lot further in life in the courtroom if you work around the court's dysfunction, the family court's dysfunction, and if you work around the judge's incompetence, as opposed to saying you need to learn how fundamental attribution errors work in psychology and therapy and alien. They're not going to learn any of that stuff. You know what they're going to learn is statutes, rules, and case law. You know who they're going to listen to? The appellate courts. There were many times when my family court judge did the wrong thing, and the only reason my family court judge changed her mind was because the Supreme Court said so, or because the Court of Appeals said so. You could go in there and you could say, Your Honor, you should not have done this. It was the wrong thing to do. You're not going to get anywhere. Or you could go in there and say, reversed and remanded. You are instructed to do this. And they understand that language. It's unfortunate that it's that way sometimes for some of us. Not all the time, just sometimes. But sometimes your judge is going to do the right thing because the Supreme Court said so. It's just this terrible reality, and him going into the fundamental attribution error and explaining all these concepts is good for a litigant to sort of understand, but don't expect to get the court or the lawyers to understand it. You have to find a way to speak their language, and they understand statutes, rules, case law. And just like you have a boss at work, so do they have a boss. Any judge has a boss. The judge's boss is going to be the Supreme Court, or in Nevada, the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. Extended non-blood families and politics. So he goes into he's trying to talk about the political sort of perspective on moving away from the nuclear family and embracing non-blood families and all that stuff. I don't know how that helps with regards to understanding his case. I don't even know if that's really a consistent policy that's going on out there. I guess maybe it is. I don't know why it matters. He spends a lot of time on that. And I don't have any comment on it. I mean, consanguinity is something that is mentioned in Nevada law with regards to all sorts of different things. Sorry guys, my phone is going crazy. Let's see. It goes into adoptions, when you can waive certain parts of the adoption process. It goes into the parental preference presumption, which is a constitutional issue that blocks third-party custody, grandparents' visitation, stuff like that. It is relevant. It's in the law. I don't see it going away. And he just spends an inordinate amount of time talking about it. Then there's also, he talks about how statistically the safest home has a biological father. And he talks about how the gender wars and feminism and all of that is getting in the way, and that there needs to be a move towards parents working together. And he touches on reconciliation and cooperation, which concerns me. What I think he's starting to do is lean away from no fault divorce, which I have seen some fathers' rights movements talk about, which doesn't make any sense. It's a crazy idea. But people need to go back and find out, why was it a problem before for people to not get out of these relationships? I mean, he's talking about abuse through the litigation process. But back in the day, there was abuse by trapping somebody in a marriage and not letting them out of it. So you're just going to trade one form of abuse for another form of abuse. What's really important is competence in the family court system. You want competence in the family court system, and these decisions have to be made by a judge. He talks about individual rights. Well, you have individual rights, Mr. Father, but so too does Ms. Mother. They both have individual rights. Obviously, those rights contradict themselves sometimes. You have two people who split up. Both of them want the kids all the time. That's physically impossible. You can't do it. Somebody's going to have to say, you're going to get the kids at this point, and you guys are going to get the kids at that point. It's just, you can't escape that. And trying to act like one person's rights are the only rights that matter just allows that one person to abuse and trample over the rights of the other person. So if he's moving in the direction of abrogating no-fault divorce, terrible, terrible idea. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 10. It's a full-blown terrible idea. Next we have what does he say here? Reluctant to imagine women as criminals, study after study, including female teachers abusing. Okay, so yeah, this is true. I mean, it goes into the gender bias issue again. It's true. I mean, everybody knows about this. The best example is when you have a female teacher that abuses a boy versus a male teacher that abuses a girl. The sentences are widely disproportionate. For the male teacher, it could be decades or life. And there was a recent one that came up for a female teacher, and she got like probation. Or maybe it was like 30 days or something like that. This is not something that is just once, every now and then. This is a pretty consistent pattern. But I don't know why. I mean, it's a reflection of society's mentality, really. And if you're trying to change the mentality of society as a whole, I guess talking about this makes sense. So, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that just because the chapter was 90% fluff for me doesn't mean it's 90% fluff for any other reader, especially a reader who hasn't gone through this. So I don't want to sort of disparage the author on that point. But I do feel like an inordinate amount of attention was given to those areas. And the other areas at the very beginning of the chapter, the first 10% of that chapter, were, in my opinion, excellent points, especially the discussion on Dr. Steve Miller. That's all that I have for you guys. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them down below, and I will see you guys next time.